Today we're in the 5th set of notes and we're going to be doing the very back page of the notes, and then we're going to be doing problems 1, 2, and 3. For all three of these problems it's going to be 3 parts. So the first part we're going to do is find the inverse. The second part we're going to do is state the domain and range for each the original and its inverse, and C, determine if the inverse is a function. So for number 1 we have f of x equals the square root of x minus 5. So in order to determine the inverse, the first thing we're going to do is change the f of x to be y. And then the process for finding the inverse is we switch x and y. And now the goal is to solve for y. So if I need to solve for y, that means I need to get rid of the square root. So the opposite of square rooting something is squaring it. So on the left side we have x squared, and on the right side y minus 5. And now to get y by itself, we would add 5 to both sides. So x squared plus 5 equals y. And if we want to put it in proper notation, we would say the inverse of f equals x squared plus 5. So letter A, this is our inverse. Letter B wants to know the domain and range of the original function and the inverse function. So my domain for my original function, two ways you could do this. You could look at the picture on a graph, or you could just think. So the smallest thing I can take is the square root of is 0, and the value that would give me a 0 underneath the square root is 5. So my domain is x is greater than or equal to 5. If I plug 5 in, 5 minus 5 is 0, and the square root of 0 is 0. So that means the matching y value when x is 5 would be 0, so my range is y is greater than or equal to 0. And again, you may use a calculator for that part. It might be easier for you to look at a picture. Then the inverse part. So now we want to know the inverse domain and range, and we talked about yesterday that the domain and range for the original function just flip-flops for the inverse. So that means my domain is now x is greater than or equal to 0, and my range will be y is greater than or equal to 5. Letter C wants to know if the inverse is a function. So if you looked at the picture, you would see a parabola, but since the domain says x is greater than or equal to 0, we would restrict half the domain and you would see half a parabola. So the picture for that function would look something to this effect, and if I did the vertical line test, it would pass. So letter C, the inverse is a function because it passes the vertical line test. So because it passes the vertical line test. Okay, so moving on to number 2. So number 2, we have f of x equals negative x squared plus 1. So y equals negative x squared plus 1. And now we switch x and y, so x equals negative y squared plus 1. We're going to subtract 1 from both sides. And now to get rid of this negative in front of my y squared, we're going to divide both sides by a negative 1. So on the left side, x divided by negative 1 is negative x. Negative 1 divided by negative 1 is a positive 1. And now to get rid of the squared on my y, we're going to square root both sides. But since you brought the square root into the problem, I need a plus or minus in front of my square root. So overall, my final answer for the first one is that the inverse of f is equal to plus or minus the square root of negative x plus 1. So letter B, my domain and range. So we're doing the domain and range for the original function, and then the inverse is just flip-flopping it. So for my domain for my original function, this is a parabola that's pointing down. And any value could go into the function. So any value I pick I could square, so that means my domain is all reals. Or you could say negative infinity less than x less than infinity. And my range, so my parabola is going to be pointing down because of this negative right here. And if you remember that your C value always represents your y-intercept. So we're dealing with a 1 for my y-intercept. And then since the parabola is pointing down, that means it's all my values that are less than or equal to 1. So now that we know that answer, it makes it very easy for the inverse. The inverse domain and range, the domain will be x is less than or equal to 1. And my range will be all reals or negative infinity less than y less than infinity. So letter C, the last question wants to know, is your inverse a function? And if you remember from the notes from the other day, the picture for this is going to look something to this effect. So it's going to be like a sideways parabola. And if I were to draw a vertical line through my picture, notice it's failing the vertical line test. So letter C, my inverse is not a function because it fails the vertical line test. So fails the vertical line test. Alright, so last one we're going to do together is number 3. So number 3, we have f of x equals the square root of x plus 3. So y equals the square root of x plus 3. We switch x and y. And now the goal is to solve for y. So we'll subtract 3. So x minus 3 equals the square root of y. And to get rid of that square root, we need to raise both sides to the second power. So we can leave our answer as the quantity of x minus 3 squared equals y. You could write x minus 3 twice and FOIL it out. You may do that, but you could also leave it in this form. Let's actually FOIL it out so it makes it... No, we'll leave it like this. Never mind. Sorry. So our inverse is x minus 3, the quantity squared. So that's letter A. Letter B, we need to do our domain and range. So our domain and range for our original function. So now we're going back to a square root. We cannot take the square root of any number in the world. We can only take the square root of positives and including 0. So in this instance, 0 is the smallest value I could put underneath the square root. So my domain is x is greater than or equal to 0. And this 3 right here will still be your y-intercept, and my range will be y is greater than or equal to 3. So that means the domain and range for my inverse, the domain will now be x is greater than or equal to 3. The range will be y is greater than or equal to 0. And letter C, x minus 3, the quantity squared, is a parabola, so it will look something to this effect. So a parabola will always be a function, so letter C, our inverse, is a function. And again, because it passes the vertical line test. Okay, that's all for today.